Appreciate that last song and the acknowledgement that comes with it that often what we face in life can be a battle. And certainly as it relates to this series, as we've been talking about the emotions that we can experience, oftentimes we feel like this is a battle, and it's a real struggle, and it's something that we have to work through, we walk through, and it's not easy. But I appreciate also the words of that song, the understanding and the expression of the fact that we know the battle also belongs to the Lord, that God is with us every step of the way, that we're not alone as we face these struggles in life. We've acknowledged as well this month, as we have been looking at this series, working through this series, I Feel You, that emotional and mental health related issues are on the rise in our country, and that we as the church are not immune and not exempt from that in any way, shape, or form. We've also acknowledged that one of the reasons, in fact, maybe one of the prime reasons, that these issues are on the rise is because we often struggle to process our thoughts and feelings as they relate to life's challenges in a healthy manner. This is something that many of us struggle with, trying to work through these deep-seated issues that we have, often tied to emotions like anxiety, or the emotion of fear, or the emotion of sadness. And last week we acknowledged, especially as it relates to sadness, that when you and I process sadness, just as it was for David, expression is often part of the solution. We've seen that in the Psalms, and I've said that several times this series already, that the Psalms are at least as much about expression, being honest, being open, being transparent, even being willing to be vulnerable in that transparency. They're at least as much about healthy expression as they are about providing a solution. But oftentimes, part of the solution is found in being willing to express what we're feeling, what we're walking through. I said that last week, and I can't tell you how many people either talked to me right after the message or sent me an email this week that touched on the fact that it is difficult, and even though we know that, and even though we would, I think, intellectually acknowledge that that's true, that oftentimes being willing to express and being willing to be honest and transparent and vulnerable before God and others, even though we would say, yes, that's part of the solution, it's still incredibly difficult to get to that place where we're willing to do that, to be that open, to be that honest. In fact, I had one lady share with me about a struggle she endured several years ago, a time she spent in the pit of depression, the pain and anguish that went along with that, but also some advice that came from some people very close to her that went something like this. Now listen, you know you can't tell anybody about this, especially not the church. Don't tell anyone about this. And it's true, and we certainly recognize this within the mental health community, but I think we recognize this within other spheres as well. There is a stigma associated at times with feeling emotions this deeply to the point that it causes us to struggle or maybe causes other related issue. There is a stigma associated with that. And our initial response is sometimes to say, well, what's wrong with that person? What kind of character flaw do they have potentially that has caused this? And certainly, as we acknowledged last week as well, and as we'll acknowledge this week, there are times where we've done something and maybe we're the cause of it and we're experiencing some guilt and some sadness, maybe even fear and anxiety that is tied to something that maybe we're directly responsible for. And so maybe some of that weight is on us, but I think often we do erroneously assume that because somebody is dealing with something, a very, very deep-seated emotional struggle, that there must be just something wrong with them, that they're a weak person, that they're flawed in character, and that's just not the case. Let me just give you a little analogy, and you may have heard this before, but I think it bears repeating. We wouldn't look at someone who had just been diagnosed with cancer and say, well, there just must be something wrong with that person. We wouldn't do that. And there are many, many good reasons why we would not do that. So why do we look at people who have been diagnosed with an emotional or mental illness, and that's our immediate assumption? There must just be something wrong with them. But on the other side of that coin, why do we at times, when we're the ones who are experiencing that struggle, when it's us, when it's me, why do I look at myself and say, well, there just must be something really wrong with me, therefore I can't share this and be honest and open with anyone? You know, what scares me about a lot of these issues is that we suffer with them behind closed doors, and we're never open and honest with people. We're never open and honest with our church family, and even scarier than that, we may never be open and honest with God about some of the deep-seated emotional issues and the related issues that go along with them that we struggle with. And as long as we are not open and honest, we will never find help. I want you to see again in David's example from last week, he gets to this place where he realizes he needs help. It's my prayer that through this series, as we have seen David express himself and be an example to us, as we've seen him willing to cry out before God and people as well. And what's wild about some of these Psalms that we have been reading together is that these Psalms became the songs of the church of several thousand years ago. And so when David writes about his emotional struggle with sadness or anxiety or fear, realize that David was writing a song that everybody was going to be singing a few weeks or months or years later. And so David was willing to become vulnerable in front of God, but then was also willing to allow his transparency and vulnerability to be an example for others so that they could see what healthy expression before God looked like. I hope that we will learn from that example. This is so important because, as Peter Scazzaro points out, spiritual and emotional health are inseparable. You can't be spiritually healthy without being emotionally healthy as well. Well, as I sent out the small group questions on Friday, and many were kind of clued into what the topic for this week was going to be, I had a handful of guys, men, email me and say, hey, this hits really close for me, what we're going to be looking at this morning. And I think this is an emotion that maybe as men we struggle to express in a healthy fashion more so than women often do. Certainly the statistics do point that out, but I don't want you to think for a second that this is isolated to the male population. We're going to look this morning, and we're going to allow David, again, through the words of the Psalms, to express for us his feelings of anger in many of the Psalms that David and others write. So this morning, if you've got your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to 1 Psalm 13, and then we'll move to Psalm 35. If you don't have it, the words will be on the screen behind me. Here's what David says in Psalm 13. Here's how he begins. And many of the Psalms in which you see anger expressed begin with these words, right here. How long, Lord? How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Listen to the desperation and anger in these words. How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. Now from Psalm 35, verses 17 through 21. Begins with the same words. How long, Lord, will you look on? Do you hear the emotion in those words? Have you ever spoken those words or at least felt what's behind those words? How long, Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my precious life from these lions. I will give thanks to you in the great assembly. Among the throngs I will praise you. Do not let those gloat over me who are my enemies without cause. Do not let those who hate me without reason maliciously wink the eye. They do not speak peaceably, but they devise false accusations against those who live quietly in the land. They sneer at me and say, Aha! Apparently, 3,000 years ago, that was a bad thing to say. I could come up with some other things that my enemies might say against me, but aha is the one that got it for David, apparently. They sneer at me and say, Aha! With our own eyes, we have seen it. So I want you to just kind of soak in those words for just a minute. And I want you to, if you have felt an emotion at some point in time that is similar to what David is expressing, or if you can just say, okay, in these words, I see the emotion that David is feeling, and I can identify with that on some level. I want you to just feel that for a second. And see the anger that he experiences as he cries out to God, how long are you going to let this go on? This isn't right. What's happening right here is not okay. What's happening around me is not okay, and what's happening to me is not okay. I don't like it, and I want it to stop. Here's some things I think we can find as we read these two Psalms. David expresses anger first, expresses an anger toward God first because he believes, he feels like he's been abandoned. Like God has left him alone. And he doesn't see that consistent with the promises or the nature of God. And he's angry about it because he feels like God is going against his own nature and maybe against what he's promised. I'll be there for you, David. Well, it sure doesn't feel like you're here for me now, God. So where are you? And there's anger in those words. The next one, and this is one that sometimes I can really identify with. David expresses anger because he's tired of being filled with anxiety and sadness. I mean, he's sick of it. Over and over again. Moves from one situation to the next where he's just experiencing anxiety, where he's feeling sadness, and he's tired of feeling this way, and he's so tired of feeling this way, he's angry about it. I mean, I think David could have used our expression right there to say that he's sick and tired of what he's feeling. He's done with it. He doesn't want any more of it. The next, and certainly I think many of us have felt this way at times, David is expressing anger because he knows that God has the power to change things, and right now he just doesn't. I know I've been there at times where I feel like, God, why aren't you changing this? I mean, I know you're not okay with this. This is not something you're good with, so why wouldn't you step in and just fix this? Make this different, make it better, make it right. Certainly as we look at injustice, and this is part of what David is doing, as we look at injustice in the world around us, there are times where that injustice makes us angry. Where you see someone mistreated, or maybe you've been mistreated yourself and you're angry about that. That's not okay. And then sometimes being angry with the situation moves to being angry with God about the situation. And the fact that it just doesn't look like he's doing anything about it. And then the last one that I notice anyway, and there's probably other things that David is expressing anger about, but the last one is David expresses anger because he believes he's doing the right thing and it's not getting him anywhere. That one you kind of have to read between the lines to find, but David says, hey, I'll go and praise you in front of everybody. I'm doing the right thing here. I go and sing your praises in front of everybody, and this is what happens in return. I mean, I'm telling everybody about how great you are, and I'm here for you, God. Are you here for me too? He believes he's doing the right thing. But doing the right thing doesn't seem to be getting him any traction in life. How about that one? Is that one you can identify with? I'm making all the right moves, God. I feel like I'm being faithful to you. I'm trusting you. I'm asking you, what is my next step? And I'm still stuck. Man, I'm looking for the next step, and I'm looking to follow you, but we're not making any progress here, and I'm not real happy about this. I think as I read through these two Psalms in particular, there's something that really jumps out at me. And maybe it does for you as well. Maybe you've already seen it in these four kind of summaries of the things that move David to express his anger with God and with the situation around him. What becomes very quickly obvious to me is that for David, it seems that anger was often tied to another emotion. He's not just experiencing anger in isolation. He's not experiencing the emotion of anger in an isolation. It's often tied to another emotion. And so what it seems to me that we have is that David expresses fear about something. My enemies are out to get me, and I'm afraid about that. I've got fear tied to that. But I'm also angry about it. Or David is experiencing sadness. How long are you going to let me be sad like this, God? How long do I have to feel this sorrow? And in his expression to God, he also expresses anger about feeling the way he feels, whether it be sadness or anxiety. I think what's interesting about this is we often move off of these emotions fairly quickly because I think somewhere within our humanity we have this belief that fear means we're all of a sudden vulnerable. If we stay there, I mean, it puts us in a vulnerable position to be afraid or to be sad or to be anxious. And somehow we believe that anger is actually a safer emotion to experience than fear, anxiety, or sadness. I think the first time this really came in view for me, I had just started my internship with a counseling center. And one of my very first clients, I think I'd been there about 2 weeks, and we'll call her Jessica. Jessica is not her name, but we'll call her Jessica. Jessica came in. She'd experienced some trouble and had been court-ordered for counseling, as many of the teens that I worked with were. And Jessica immediately was a puzzle to me, an absolute enigma. This little girl was more filled with anger than anyone I'd ever seen before in my life. I mean, she was so angry. I would try to be as kind to her as I could possibly be. I would try to just elicit some talk and just be as genuine and as warm as I could possibly be with her, and all I'd get back from her was anger. Nonstop, just anger. And there was a time, as time went on, where Jessica began to be a little bit more open with me about her life and things she had experienced. But it took time. It took time, and I began to see that for Jessica, anger was a shield. It was a defense mechanism that she had thrown up so that she didn't have to feel the incredible sadness that she was carrying around deep inside of her. In fact, she almost used her anger as a way to wall off an emotion that she just could not allow herself to experience, because she was afraid if she did, well, she just didn't know what would happen. See, Jessica's dad had left fairly early on in her life. But before leaving, he had been abusive to her mom. He'd been abusive to Jessica in multiple different ways. And he left her with deep, deep pain. And still, the interactions that she had with him from time to time, everyone left her feeling empty and broken. And the only way she knew how to deal with that sadness was by becoming angry. That's it. The only way she felt like she could survive and somehow be strong was to be angry about what she was feeling. And so it took some time, and as a counselor, it was incredibly difficult for me to maintain the faith that I'm supposed to maintain as we worked to unpack those feelings that she had, and she started to experience breakthroughs and started to really feel the sadness that she felt over all of these horrible things that her dad had done to her. I mean, it was difficult for me to not cry alongside of her. But as I watched her experience sadness and walk through that in a healthy way, I also started to watch her deal with her anger for the first time ever in a healthy way. And certainly there would still be times where she'd walk in and I could tell she wasn't in a great mood, and I was going to get some nasty little remarks from her right at the beginning of our session. But over time, I watched her experience some healing that she'd never experienced, because her first impulse was to take that vulnerable emotion and run to one she thought would give her a position of strength. Yeah, I think this is true for many of us, that it often seems as though anger is a safer emotion than anxiety, fear, or sadness. It just seems that way, that anger is going to be a safer place to be, because we look at fear and we say, well, that means weakness. We look at sadness and we say, well, that's weakness. Anxiety, that's weakness. Oh, but anger, that makes me feel strong and it makes me feel powerful. I want to tell you this morning that it often seems as though anger is a safer emotion than fear or sadness, but that's an illusion. That is not the truth. We're going to look at two more scriptures out of the New Testament that I think will expose this truth to us just a little bit more fully, and then try to get some takeaways as to how we ought to deal with our anger that hopefully will give us some very practical things that we can try to do. If anger is something you struggle with, some very practical pieces you can put into place before we leave here this morning. The first scripture is from James chapter 1. We're going to look at just verses 19 and 20, and then we'll be in Ephesians chapter 4, which David touched on a little bit earlier this morning already. Here's what James says about anger. He says, "Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. You must be quick to listen, all of you. Not some of you, not just the leaders among you." He says, all of you must be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Now listen to these words. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So human anger, and James does qualify that, says human anger, the kind that's tied to the other emotions that we're not processing in a healthy manner, the kind that's often tied to pride or getting our feelings stepped on, and now we're angry in response. James says that kind of anger does not, will not, cannot produce the righteousness that God desires. And then these next words from the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 26 through 27, that should say. Paul says this to the Ephesian church: don't sin by letting anger control you. Okay, so don't sin by letting anger control you. And then he says, don't let the sun go down while you are still angry. Why? And Paul says very plainly, anger gives a foothold to the devil. Those are pretty big words. Anger gives a foothold to the devil. So out of these short four verses, what do we learn? Well, actually, if you read between the lines, you do find out, first, that it is okay to be angry. It actually is okay to be angry. James says, be slow to get angry. It's okay to be angry. Paul says, don't sin in your anger. which tells us implicitly that it is okay to be angry. There are things we should be angry about. Just as God is angry about some things. David touched on one of those in his communion thoughts this morning. God is angry at the effects of sin on the people he loves. God's love must move him to be angry about sin, and must move him to be angry at the one who leads us into sin and temptation. It moves him to that. If God was not angry, then we would look at God and say, well, do you really love us? How much do you love us? No, it's God's incredible love for us that allows him to be angry and broken when he sees the people he loves wounded, when a wall is driven between him and the people he loves. And so there are times when anger is the right response. The next thing, actually before that, let me point this out. I think John Bloom does a great way of kind of wrapping this idea of God's righteous anger into a really neat little package. And this is what he says in 3 short sentences. God is not fundamentally angry. If that's your understanding of God, that is an old Greco-Roman understanding of God and not the Christian understanding of God. God is not fundamentally angry. God is fundamentally righteous. That's an incredibly important distinction. So God is not fundamentally angry. He is fundamentally righteous, and his anger is a byproduct of his righteousness. So because God is righteous, there are times where he has to be angry at unrighteousness. But God's anger is never rooted in unrighteousness, but only righteousness. So again, it's okay to be angry. Then the second piece, it's actually okay to express anger as well. Both of these are okay and are sometimes necessary. There are times when being angry about something leads you into a constructive conflict situation. And that's good and that's healthy. Again, pay attention to those words and the qualifier in there, a constructive conflict resolution situation. When it leads you to that place to pursue resolution of conflict in a constructive and healthy manner, then anger is okay to express. It's a good thing to express. But we also get this advice when we combine these two passages is that we shouldn't go there quickly. And that speaks to a lot of us who have a short fuse as it relates to anger. And fellas and ladies as well, it speaks to all of us who just use that as an excuse. Say, well, I just have a short fuse. My mom had a short fuse. My dad had a short fuse. I have red hair. I'm Irish. I'm whatever. So I get to be angry quickly. It's okay. I have a license to quick anger. No, you don't. And in fact, that's a wildly unhealthy way to pursue the expression of anger. And so if you have a short fuse, listen to these words. And don't give yourself an excuse. But even in that area of your life, submit yourself to God so that he can take your short fuse and maybe through a miraculous infusion make it a long fuse. But then the second admonition in that is don't stay there long. I'll tell you this, I've actually seen some people with a short fuse who go there pretty quickly, but they also come out of there pretty quickly. They need to learn something, there's no doubt. But I've also seen a number of folks, it takes them a long time to get there. But once they get there, boy, they're stuck. And they're going to be angry for a long time. People who hold grudges come to mind. People who get stuck in bitterness and can't move forward from that come to mind. And God tells us through James and Paul that you don't get a pass on either side of that. Don't go there quickly. Don't stay there long. And then the last thing that we learn is this, that anger can be a dangerous emotion because our enemy knows just how to use it against us. In your anger, don't sin. Don't give the devil a strategic foothold in your life, and anger can do that. I think it's pretty amazing to me, and I can actually be maybe honest with my own life. There are times where I have been so angry about something that I become hardened, and so I'm not soft. So I can't really, it's hard for God to approach me and get through kind of the callous state of my heart when I'm angry, and so I'll start expressing myself in ways that are just totally unacceptable, and, well, if I'm honest, are actually sinful. And I'll justify it, and I think I'm fine because I'm angry. I'm angry, so I have the right to mistreat people. I have the right to do things that are going to make me feel happy in this moment because I'm angry, and so I almost feel like I deserve something, maybe. I don't think I'm alone in that. Or else Paul and James wouldn't have had to address it and say, hey, listen, you got to be incredibly careful with anger because anger will move you to a place where you are very vulnerable to sin. Extremely vulnerable to sins of all kinds. You think the devil wants a foothold in your life just so that he can mess with you as far as it relates to anger? Or do you think he uses that as an entry point to cause all sorts of mischief in your life? If you've got an anger problem that is undealt with, look out, because someone's going to use that. I want to pray over us in this moment, and then we're actually going to move to wrap up this series. But I want to pray a specific prayer for any of you who may be wrestling with anger, with unresolved and undealt with anger, especially if you realize that it has become a problem in your life to where the devil has a foothold in your life because of this. And I want to pray a prayer of deliverance, but I also want to pray a prayer of conviction, because I imagine in a crowd this size, there are a number of us who have given ourselves a pass on this and said it's okay for me to be angry because, and it's okay for me to act that way when I'm angry because. And so as we pray, I want you to realize who we're talking to. And if you need to check out on my prayer and you just need to have a conversation with him yourself, that's great. Do it. We're going to pray together, and then we're going to transition and wrap up this series. It's my hope that in the next few minutes, God moves powerfully among us. Let's pray. Father, first, I want to acknowledge for myself, and I want to be honest and vulnerable in front of this group and confess that there are times where I have allowed anger in my life to get a hold of me in a way to where I have allowed the devil to creep into my life, and I have been able to justify things that I would never say yes to, whether it's mistreating someone, whether it's pride, a haughty attitude, whatever it is, because I did not allow you to work in me, and anger was not processed in a healthy way. Because not only did I get angry quickly, I held on to it for a long time. God, I want to pray for those in our midst this morning who are struggling with this in their lives as well. Knowing as well that there are times when their unresolved anger moves them to lash out, to justify sin in their lives, when that anger is even a gateway to sin within their lives. I want to pray first that prayer of conviction. God, there are some in here this morning, through the power of the Holy Spirit, whose hearts need to be touched, so they will not continue to make excuses, but they'll cry out for help instead. And then, Father, for those who may be crying out for help right now and even praying their own words to you in this moment, I also pray a prayer of deliverance. That, Father, they would submit themselves to you and allow you to trim away the pieces and allow you to help them unpack the other emotions that are tied to this anger so they can move forward in a healthy way and live in the freedom, Jesus, that you died to give us. So I pray away the bondage and the shackles of the anger that chains us. I pray these away in the power of your name, Jesus. And amen. As I said, we're wrapping up this series together, and there's certainly been some overtones throughout this entire series. Some very strong commonalities and common threads as it relates to dealing with anxiety, or dealing with fear in our lives, or dealing with anger and sadness. As Ben said in week 2, as it relates to fear, when we struggle with fear, when we're afraid about what's going to happen, it's actually an invitation into intimacy with God. That's true about all these emotions. If you struggle with anger, God is inviting you into a relationship with Him in which you find healing. But it begins right here. It begins with making the choice. Nobody can do that for you. Only you can do it for yourself. In a counseling relationship, I could never choose this for any of my clients. I could never make them choose to be transparent and honest. And I can't do this with you either. You can only do this for yourself. Choosing to be honest and transparent, especially before God. It's not just a good idea. It's not just good advice. It's so much more than that. It is essential to spiritual and emotional health. So it is my hope that through this series and through these last several weeks, you have been challenged, or maybe your mind has been opened. Maybe you're just asking yourself the question, what would happen if I was honest with God first about whatever it is I'm struggling with? And then maybe that you would take it to the next step as well. And you would ask yourself, what if there was one, maybe just one person, maybe two, maybe your small group that you've been meeting with for the last year? What if there was someone I could be open and honest and transparent with as well? This morning, really, that is the invitation as we wrap up this series, is that you would find someone and you would ask them the question, do you feel me on this? Do you understand what I'm going through? And that you would land at this place solidly and squarely where you know God does feel you. In Jesus, who experienced everything that we experienced, all the human emotions, all the struggles that we experienced, God does feel you. I do want to give you the opportunity this morning. In a second, we're going to stand and we're going to sing. And if you need to respond, if you want the prayers of this church, that opportunity is absolutely open to you. If you just need to find someone afterward and say, hey, would you, instead of going to class, would you cut out with me just for a few minutes and I need to talk and I need to pray. I beg you, don't let this time go by. Conviction doesn't always last. So conviction and resolution have to lead to action if we want to see something change and move. And sometimes the window on that conviction and resolution is pretty short. So if you're feeling that right now, if God has worked in you that way this morning, my prayer is that you'll do something about it. Not tomorrow, but today.